Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to talk about schizophrenia and how schizophrenia impacts our brain. So, to get started, let's take a look at what schizophrenia is. If we break up that word, schizophrenia, well, schizo or schism translates to split, and phrenia translates to mind. So, schizophrenia is a split mind. And we need to use a little bit of caution when we're using that phrase, split mind, because sometimes students confuse that with dissociative identity disorder, what we used to call multiple personality disorder, because some people describe DID as having a split personality. So we need to be really careful. Schizophrenia and DID are not the same thing. They're very different disorders. Dissociative disorders, the disconnect is between your mind and your identity. In other words, it's a disconnect with your memories. Whereas with schizophrenia, the split or the disconnect is between your mind and reality, with what's really happening in this world. I will say things like, with dissociative identity disorder, you may have a person transition from their host self to this made up identity that possesses some of their past memories of trauma. Whereas with schizophrenia, you may have someone who temporarily believes that they are a god or a celebrity or something along those lines. They sound similar. There appears to be some overlap. Hopefully, by the end of this lecture, you will understand the big differences between the two. Schizophrenia is categorized by two main types of symptoms. We have what are called positive symptoms and we have negative symptoms. So let's take a look at what those symptoms look like. Positive symptoms. Positive symptoms is when we have the addition or the presence of behaviors that shouldn't be there. Some common positive symptoms include hallucinations and delusions. You may mix up those words or use them interchangeably, but hallucinations and delusions mean very different things. Hallucinations are when we have false perceptions, when we believe that we see something or we hear something that is not actually there. If you are hallucinating, you may believe that you are watching something happen, even if it's not happening. If you're hallucinating, you may believe that you are smelling a scent that doesn't actually exist in the atmosphere. It's a false perception. And the most common hallucinations are auditory, hearing sounds that aren't there. Delusions, on the other hand, are false beliefs. Delusions are when you believe something to be true when it isn't. And I'm not talking about just being mistaken. If you think today's chicken nugget day, but really it's ham and cheese roll up day, that's not a delusion. A delusion is this deep seated false belief about reality. For example, some people with schizophrenia suffer from paranoia, this belief that people are out to hurt them, they're out to get them, they're spying on them, they're following them. Another common delusion is a delusion of grandeur. This is a delusion where you feel like you're more important than you actually are, which sounds bad, right? But a delusion of grandeur might be this idea where I believe I am the most important person in the world, or I believe the world will end if I don't fix things. Or maybe I believe that I'm the president or a dictator or some kind of deity or God. Those are all principles of grandeur, or sorry, delusions of grandeur. We also have delusions of influence, where some people with schizophrenia believe that their actions, their behaviors are out of their control. Maybe their mind is being controlled by the government, or maybe they are being controlled by aliens or something along those lines. And then also delusions of sin or guilt, where people with schizophrenia may feel that they've done something horribly wrong when they haven't, but they have this delusion that they are guilty of something. So delusions, false beliefs, hallucinations, false perceptions. And make sure you know the difference between those and can provide examples of the difference between those. Another positive symptom is what we call disorganized or nonsensical speech, where a person is speaking, but what they are saying doesn't make any sense. Their thoughts and their words are disconnected. This is sometimes referred to as literally word salad, where you can imagine where we take a bunch of words and write them down on note cards and mix them up and then pull them out and then just read what we have in front of us. Wouldn't make any sense at all. That's not too uncommon as a positive symptom of schizophrenia. It's this disorganized thinking and this disorganized speech. And then also tardive dyskinesia is a positive symptom where people have uncontrollable muscle movements. We see it often in the face, where the face may have twitches, where the jaw may move, fidgeting with the legs and your feet, moving your arms and your trunk or your waist around. So we have these uncontrollable muscle movements, and that often comes as a side effect to antipsychotic medications. And so we see this with a lot of schizophrenic patients as well. So these are positive symptoms. And again, don't think that means they're good. Positive is not meaning good symptoms. They are positive because we see the addition or the presence of behavior that otherwise should not be there. Sometimes with schizophrenia, we have negative symptoms, and it's what you would likely anticipate. Negative symptoms is when you should have something present, some behavior, some action present, but it's not there. Flat affect is an emotionless face. And so you might tell someone with schizophrenia some really horrible news, something really bad that we would expect some kind of emotional reaction, and they're just completely blank. That's the idea of flat affect. There should be the presence of an emotional response, and there isn't. Reduced social interaction and avolition. This is when I say less motivation, less focus, think wandering aimlessly, right? There's no motivation for having any specific or particular actions or movements. Reduced social interaction, pretty straightforward, where we anticipate that with normal, healthy, functioning humans that we have some element of social interaction, and that might not be present. And then if a person is catatonic, then it's almost as if they're paralyzed at times. There's this muscle rigidness where they may not move for hours. So not just that they're slow to move around, but they're literally not moving around for hours or maybe a day or you name it. This is the negative symptom of being catatonic. And we see that occasionally with schizophrenia. Catatonia as a symptom shows up for a number of different disorders. So onset and prevalence, just as a reminder, onset is kind of when do we tend to see symptoms show up, and prevalence is how often do we see this happen. Well, schizophrenia impacts about 1% of the population. If you just take a random sample of people, they've got about a 100 chance of developing some symptoms of schizophrenia. As far as onset, when do we see symptoms show up? Late teens, early 20s is when most people start to show symptoms of schizophrenia, and it is slightly more common in men than it is in women. There are two types of schizophrenia, two main types of schizophrenia. The first is what we call acute schizophrenia. And acute schizophrenia happens quite quickly. There's this rapid onset. It's usually associated with a highly stressful event, and we see lots of positive symptoms, so lots of hallucinations, lots of delusions, and things like that. And the good news, the silver lining of acute schizophrenia, is they are often more responsive to medication, to antipsychotic meds, and things like that. Whereas with chronic schizophrenia is this gradual kind of decline into the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. It usually takes longer for that full onset to happen. And because most of the symptoms are negative symptoms, they don't respond as well to treatment. When we talk about treatment at a later time, we'll see how schizophrenia is often associated with dopamine, and medications impact dopamine, but the problem is with the negative symptoms, it's not as associated with that particular neurotransmitter. So some risk factors for schizophrenia. First of all, there's a pretty strong genetic influence. You heard me in just this last slide that a random person plucked off the street, chances of schizophrenia is about 1 in 100. If one of your biological parents has schizophrenia, the odds of developing schizophrenia yourself jumps from 1 in 100 to about 1 in 50. And if you have an identical twin and your identical twin has schizophrenia, that number drops to 1 in 2. Now, notice I said 1 in 2 and not 1 in 1. The fact that it's not 100% if your identical twin has schizophrenia, then you'll have schizophrenia. We know that it's not strictly genetic. There is just an incredibly strong connection between our genes and developing schizophrenia. There are other biological factors to take into consideration. The older a father is, a biological father is at conception, that can increase your risk. And then also, we know, for example, that if a woman is in her second trimester during flu season, that those children are more likely to develop schizophrenia. And so things like, a person getting really sick, there's this maternal virus, can increase that risk. Oxygen deprivation, so if the umbilical cord is wrapped around the neck during delivery, that can increase your risk as well. Now, I want to talk just for a second about this concept, what we call the diathesis stress model. And I want you to imagine that you're going to bake a cake. So here's my kind of analogy for you. If you're going to bake a cake, we hope that you have two things on hand, that you have all the ingredients and you have the recipe. If you have all the ingredients but you don't have the recipe, you might make a cake, but it might not be very good. If you have a recipe but you don't have all the ingredients, then you might be able to substitute some things out, like maybe you don't have milk, but you're going to use something else instead. You might make a cake, but it's probably not going to be very good. You really need both of those things, right? Well, developing schizophrenia and other major mental health issues will often fall under this diathesis stress model. And the idea behind this is people perhaps have what's called a genetic predisposition for developing a disorder. Maybe you have a person who has all of the pieces internally, the genetic predisposition that they are at high risk of developing a disorder. And then you add with that an environment, in this case, a very stressful environment, then that will increase the chance of developing schizophrenia. But if you have someone with a genetic predisposition that does not have this stressful environment, then the chance of them developing schizophrenia is relatively low. Just like someone can have a very stressful environment, but if they don't have that same genetic predisposition, their chance is pretty low. But you put those two things together, the ingredients and the recipe, that's when the chance is going to increase. And again, when I say the chance increases, we're still talking about 1%, about 1 in 100. So our last slide here, how does schizophrenia impact and influence the brain? Well, first of all, one of the leading theories to the development of schizophrenia is that there are too many dopamine receptors. And so we've talked a little bit about the synapse and neurotransmitters crossing the synapse, specifically dopamine. Dopamine makes us feel good. Well, one thing we found in the brains of people who have schizophrenia is they have too many dopamine receptors. Lots of dopamine can lead to hallucinations. And we see this with some drugs. Drugs that release a lot of dopamine can lead to a hallucination. The way that antipsychotic medications work is they block dopamine. That makes sense. So earlier I said, if you have a lot of positive symptoms, medications tend to help. Well, positive symptoms like hallucinating, medications, they reduce dopamine, they reduce those hallucinations. Your frontal lobe is your critical thinking thought center, right? It's your frontal lobe that allows you to recognize the difference between reality and things that are not actually happening. When you dream, okay, when you fall asleep and when you're having dreams, your frontal lobes are very inefficient. They don't work very well, which is why your dreams can be very bizarre and kind of out of this world and falsely connected to reality. When you're a little kid, when you're a little child, your frontal lobes are not very efficient, which partially explains why children have such vivid imaginations for things that aren't real. Now we apply that to schizophrenia. Inefficient frontal lobes can help explain, perhaps, why they may be loosely attached to reality. The thalamus, this is fascinating. Remember, the thalamus is what is directing sensory information. With visual information should go to your visual cortex, and sounds go to your auditory cortex, things like that. Well, right now, if you just imagine your favorite song and what that sounds like, or if you daydream and you just imagine seeing something in your room that's not actually there, well, we wouldn't see that activity in your thalamus because there's no sensory information. You're not actually seeing that object that you're imagining. You're not actually hearing the song that you're imagining. So your thalamus isn't very active. But if someone with schizophrenia is hallucinating, let's say they're hearing a voice that doesn't actually exist, their thalamus is lighting up as if that voice is in the room, which tells us they're not just thinking it, they're not just imagining seeing or hearing something. Their brain literally believes it's happening. Their thalamus is sending information as if it is getting sensory stimuli. And then finally, we talked in our last lecture about this idea of gray matter. Remember, gray matter is the surface of our brain, right? All that surface area where most of the neurons, somas, are located. One thing we have looked at when we've compared a healthy brain to a brain of someone with schizophrenia is that a brain with schizophrenia is smaller. It weighs less. And part of that is because there is a loss of gray matter. There is a thinning of the surface of the brain. And the ventricles, we talked a little bit about ventricles as well. The ventricles are the natural gaps that we have in our brain. If you were to take a brain and slice it in half, you would see these gaps that are filled with cerebral fluid. Well, that's normal, but we see that in a brain with schizophrenia, those ventricles are enlarged. So they have more cerebral fluid and less cortex, less matter of the brain. Again, helps explain why the weight, the size of a brain of schizophrenia is smaller and lighter than that of a healthy brain. So we talked about some of the possible causes. We talked about the symptoms. We talked about who it impacts. Quite a bit to kind of jam pack in this lecture. If you have any questions, certainly feel free to email me. We'll talk more about this later, and I'll show you some videos and things to help this kind of come to life to you.